Already mentioned, I am Reem. I'm a PhD candidate in UC Davis, and I'm also a graduate student coordinator of the Global Migration Center in UC Davis. So today I will present a paper that is co-authored with my advisor, Giovanni Peri. And in this paper, we discuss the changes in international immigration and internal native mobility after COVID-19. So everywhere in the world, COVID-19 led to rapid and evolving changes in the US labor market. More prominently or most prominently was the large drop in employment and labor force participation in the first few months, so between January and April 2020, and that was especially apparent for females. And the labor market after that recovered slowly, so it almost took 2 years. By July 22, employment went back to its January 2020 level, and that's almost 158 million employed individuals. But while there was a small dip in the unfilled job vacancies, the US later on experienced a very large increase between April 2020 and January 2022. There was almost about 12 million unfilled vacancies, and that's a jump from almost 4% of employment to 7.1%, which is still persistent till now. However, it is very important to note that there was very large variation in the incidence of these shocks across industries and geographies within the US. So as a consequence, a lot of papers or studies were trying to find what are the factors that affected this employment and the large increase in vacancies. And some factors that were focused on were increased retirement, early retirement, resignation or reallocation across jobs, especially with the introduction of remote work, large welfare benefits that were sent out by the government, and the lack of childcare. But one less explored factor was the significant drop in immigration flows and almost the stagnation of the immigrant population and immigrant employment. And that has started actually before COVID. So it started with the Trump administration limiting visa issuances and slowing green card processing in 2017, but COVID-19 entirely stopped international travel. So basically, the pandemic strengthened a phenomenon that was already happening. So here an open question remains whether the migration drop contributes to explaining the missing workers in the US labor market, and whether it contributes in explaining the sharp increase in vacancies. So what we do in this paper is multiple things. First, we document some major changes in the US economy during and after COVID-19. And here we focus on showing changes in immigration, remote employment, and job vacancies, and characterizing each of them. And then, given a big literature in the US that shows that internal mobility of natives in almost any dimension of geography has been declining for the last 3 decades, we check whether this has changed during and after COVID, and then we try to connect the drop in international immigration with this native mobility controlling for other shocks. So the main question would be, did natives replace the missing foreign-born workers in the market? And then finally, we check whether labor market shocks contributed to this spike in job vacancies in the US labor market. So just a quick preview of findings. We document a substantial drop in immigration that varied a lot across states and sectors. There was a large change in remote work opportunities that also varied across sectors and states. However, all in all, we find no evidence of shocks affecting shocks affecting in the short run native internal mobility across states or sectors. So very briefly, to check all these trends, we basically rely on the current population survey, which is an individual level survey in the US. We rely on 2 versions of it, the monthly, which extends from January 2010 to July 2022. And this survey includes each individual's country of birth, employment status, and industry. We map their industry into the Bureau of Labor Statistics classification, which only includes 17 broad sectors. And then we also rely on a module that was introduced in May 2020 that studied basically the pandemic mode of work. So in that module, there was a question that asked individuals whether they worked in the past week remotely due to the pandemic. So we construct a dummy that indicates that. And then in order to measure geographic mobility, we rely on the March supplement, which extends from 2010 to 2022. And here we basically construct two measures of mobility. The first one is internal geographic mobility, and that will use information on the individual's residence in year T-1 and in year T. If they had changed their residence, then we consider them moved across states. And we are able to see their previous state of residence. So we are able to measure inflows, outflows, and net flows from a state. And then we also construct a native industrial sector mobility. And for this one, we rely on information on the industry of employment 1 year ago. So we create a dummy for employment mobility across sectors that takes one if the industry in T is different from that of T-1. However, the individual should be working in both periods in order to, so this is conditional on their employment in both periods. So let me start first by showing the trends in immigration of foreign-born individuals. Here in this figure, we show the US working age foreign-born population at the monthly level. It's plotted in the solid line. And then the dashed line is basically the linear trend for this population from January 2010 to the pre-COVID peak, which is actually May of 2019. And then we project this trend into July 2022. So in the 9 years before COVID here, the yearly inflow or the number of working age foreign-born individuals grew by almost 660,000 per year. However, after that, in all of this period post-COVID, there was only 300,000 additional individuals. So by July 2022, the gap was almost 1.65 million foreign-born individuals. So that's where we start basically to think about what are the implications of this on the US labor market and US employment. So in order to later understand how this drop could affect employment, we basically decompose the drop in immigration by skill composition, by age, states, countries of origin, and sectors. And this characterization will just give insight into which type of labor or which type of labor markets could be most affected. So the first one is by skill. So it's just the same trend now divided by college educated and non-college educated. And here there are basically two main points. The first one is the growth of the college educated immigrants is much steeper than that of the non-college educated. Almost 480,000 college educated immigrants are added per year compared to only 180,000 non-college educated. And the college educated stagnation or drop perfectly coincides with COVID. So it starts in basically March 2020 here, and then the gap closes pretty fast, while that of the non-college educated starts pre-COVID, so with the Trump administration, and the gap is huge. The gap here is almost, by July 2022, 1.1 million individuals. And if you recall, there were 1.65 million individuals missing from the labor market. So the majority of them are non-college educated. Importantly, we also see a decline in the foreign-born population that is attending college, so international students who come into the US. The decline or the slowdown starts pre-COVID, but then there is a dip. This is the 12-month moving average. So then there is a dip in this population after COVID. And that has important implications given a literature that shows that almost one-fourth to one-fifth of this population ends up working in the US. So this decline will contribute to the reduction in the young, highly educated workers later on in the US labor market for years. And then when we look by age group, I just want to emphasize here that the biggest proportion of the drop is among individuals in their prime working age. These are the people who usually have the highest employment rate in the US labor market. There are tiny drops for the younger populations, but it goes back to trend. And when we look by the top immigration states, there's a lot. In general, there is a drop in during COVID, but it varies a lot across states. So California and Florida are the most affected. However, we can see New York, Illinois, New Jersey, they slow down, but then they go back to trend. While Texas, which has been driving the immigration growth for the past decade, just continues on trend. So later on, what we will do is we will use this differential inflow of migrants across states in order to look at the impact of that on the mobility of natives. And just to give you an idea, so when we look by population of origin, here we focus on the top countries of origin the last years. So the Mexican population, for instance, mirrors a lot what's happening with the non-college educated. So there's a drop that starts before COVID, and then they carry on. But for instance, for individuals from India, their trend mirrors a lot that of the college-educated individuals. And for China, they just remain on a constant growth trajectory. Then finally, we characterize the changes in immigration across sectors to check which sectors are more potentially affected. So here we show the evolution of the foreign-born employed population in sectors where immigrants represented more than 20% of workers pre-pandemic. And then so each point is basically the foreign-born employment, and then we standardize it to January 2020. So it's 100 here, and then it's the percent change from that. So overall, foreign-born employment had a decrease during the pandemic in each sector. And that decrease was at least by 10%. But then if we look at sectors such as accommodation and food services, so this sector had a huge drop, almost by 30% of foreign-born employment. It is also interesting to note that this is actually the sector that had the largest number of unfilled vacancies later on in 2022. Other sectors such as health were also affected, but the most affected one was basically accommodation and food services. So all in all, just to sum up, the immigrant drop was concentrated among non-college educated individuals. There was a particularly large drop among the young individuals, Mexicans, and those doing manual intensive jobs. And the industries that were most affected included food, hospitality, and personal services. So next, we check whether these sectors that lost immigrants also had limited remote work options and whether they required in-person work. So here I show basically a bar chart that shows the percent of workers who were employed remotely, and the average of that between May 2020 and December 2020, and then we divide that to the 17 broad sectors we focus on. So there's a lot of variation in sectors such as finance and insurance and information. More than 50% of workers were employed or did jobs remotely, while on the opposite end of the spectrum, construction, accommodation, and services, less than 10% of them actually worked remotely. So these are sectors with the prevalence of in-person, manual, physical intensive jobs, and they are mainly performed by non-college educated individuals. And when we look at this figure by education, so for the college and non-college educated, the same trend appears there. In fact, if we just also look at the correlation between the reliance of a sector on foreign-born workers pre-pandemic and the availability of remote work in that sector, we see that there is a clear, significant negative correlation. So in sectors that basically had pre-pandemic more foreign-born workers, these are the sectors that also have a very low availability of remote work later on. So these are possibly the sectors that experienced the largest supply shock in the pandemic. Lastly, we also document the large spike in job vacancies, and this is related to what I already mentioned in the introduction. So the job vacancy rate basically is a measure of mismatch between labor supply and labor demand in the market. And here we just show the number of vacancies as a percent of employment. There is this small dip here, but then there is this massive increase after that, and not until the last 3 months of the sample period that this starts decreasing. I haven't checked the latest data, so I'm not sure if it goes back, but it's still an issue in the media. So we next check whether the drop in foreign-born individuals and the lack of remote work options together account for this vacancy increase. So this is all just correlational. We're just correlating the reliance of the sector on the on the foreign-born workers, and the correlation with that with the rates of unfilled jobs or the labor shortages. And basically, there is a very weak positive correlation indicating that higher vacancies are in sectors where the drop, where the immigrant drop was more consequential. And then when we relate the rates of unfilled jobs with the availability of remote work, there's also a weak correlation similar to the previous one, but in the opposite direction. So both of these figures basically say that sectors experiencing less in foreign workers and small availability of remote work are also those experiencing the highest level of unfilled jobs. However, the correlation is not that strong.
Sorry, Reem.
Yes.
Hi, very nice presentation. I wanted to ask a question. I read the paper and I was wondering, from my understanding is that from now on you look at the impact of this reduction in international mobility on native internal mobility. But do you do also the causal analysis of the impact of the reduction in international mobility on vacancies?
We do.
You do.
I will show you that in the end. To be honest, it's not a very strong effect. And we use the same panel regression that we used for the native mobility, just with a different outcome, which is the vacancies.
Okay, thank you.
So basically what I have shown you so far is that there are significant changes in immigration, vacancies, and remote work. And those factors have created imbalances across the labor markets. And they are uneven across sectors and states. So now moving on, the main question will be, did that trigger native mobility? So first, we analyze indicators of overall annual native mobility, and then we would look on native mobility in relation to these state-specific shocks. So the main question is, do natives actually fill those jobs that immigrants just left vacant? So I will update the data on native mobility within and across US states. And in all of the measures that I will show you, this is 1-year mobility measures. So we are considering people who moved within the last year in the March CPS. So it's from March to March as a percent of the working age population. A very main limitation is that we only had 2 post-COVID years, which is 2021 and 2022. So here we show the mobility measure that I was just mentioning in the solid line between states, so the number of people moving between states, and in the dashed line within states. The between states is much lower than the within states, and it has been steady. There has been like a very slow decrease in mobility within states. Most importantly, that after COVID in these 2 years, there doesn't seem to be a break in the trend. So it continues going down. And then when we look at that by college education, our initial thought was maybe non-college educated individuals' mobility could be increasing, especially given the sectors that labor shortages were in. But although there is a very small increase, it does not account for the large drop in immigration, so it's not very comparable. So basically, there is a continued decline and stability of mobility overall and across states, and there is a similar pattern for different educational groups. The continued decline in mobility is also for the young and for the prime working age individuals, although I did not include these figures today. And there is a decline also in mobility for employment reasons. So we don't see a huge break in trend. The aggregate internal mobility measures do not show a jump that is comparable to the changes in immigrant population or the huge increase in vacancies in the US. But here, just to quantify this relationship, we then look at the correlation between the native mobility patterns and the change in foreign-born. So here the x-axis is basically the change in foreign-born population between 2020 and 2022. And the y-axis for each figure is basically average inflows into a state, average outflows from a state, and net flows. And basically, there is no evidence of immigrant replacement across labor markets. So most of the correlations here are not significant. And there is no correlation between interstate and the change in foreign-born population. And then when we look at the same thing on the y-axis, but now the x-axis has remote work availability, this shows basically that the correlation is a bit stronger. There is some correlation here, and it shows that when there is a higher opportunity for remote work, so as we go right on the x-axis, basically this is associated with reduced inflows of natives into a state, and this negative correlation is actually significant. The coefficient is large enough to show that states with a 1 standard deviation higher remote work share are associated with 1/3 of standard deviations lower in mobility. So then in order to analyze the native mobility response in a more systematic way, we analyze whether native in, out, and net migration in a state is affected by immigrants. And we examine whether this is different before COVID. So, sorry, this is different after COVID. So basically, we run a panel regression across states S and years T, and we control for labor demand shocks through a Bartik instrument, and we also control for remote work opportunities post-COVID. So here the outcomes are the number of natives who migrated into, out to, or at net from a state. And the delta immigration is basically the change in the number of foreign-born individuals between year T and T-1. And then we interact that with a post-COVID dummy, which takes 1 if the year was 2021 or 2022. And then we also include this remote measure here, which basically is the average number of individuals working remotely as a % of population. We also interact that with the post-COVID dummy. And we add state fixed effects, year fixed effects, and cluster the standard errors at the state level. I will mention the Bartik employment measure in a second. So basically, these are obviously up till now correlations because the change of immigration is not random, correlated with other economic conditions that are happening at the same time, and that could affect native mobility. So we use a shift-share IV that basically proxies for immigration flows based on the shares of immigrants by nationality in 2010. So this is the very standard version of the shift-share IV. And then we interact the shares in 2010 for each country of origin by the national growth in immigrants from that country. And everything is standardized by the population of the state in 2010 before the pandemic. And then, as I mentioned, we control for the sector-driven labor demand changes, or the Bartik. And this variable uses the 2010 shares of employment of each of the 17 broad sectors that we've been working with up until now. And we interact that with the national employment change for each industry. So this term basically captures the increase or decrease in labor demand in a state due to the growth or decline of that industry nationally. Again, a lot of caveats and limitations, the most important of which are that this is a very short-run response. We only have 1-year periods and 1-year changes. There are only 2 years of post-COVID, so the analysis is largely underpowered. And while for such analysis, the best geographic area to be studied would be a local labor market, such as a commuting zone, we are restricted with the data to only look at the state level. But keeping these limitations in mind, basically, I will show you now the results. And both the OLS and the 2SLS specifications show that most coefficients are actually not significant. So that only confirms that there is a lack of response of native mobility to labor market shocks. Rows 2 and 3 here, so the change in immigration, they say that the states that lost more immigrants did not experience an inflow of natives. To the contrary, they have an outflow of the natives. And at the state level, Bartic shocks or labor demand and remote availability does not seem to translate also into short-run response of natives. Then when we separate that response by college-educated and non-college educated, we actually find very similar results. So the college-educated natives are more complementary with immigrants, so they move out of a state due to the loss of immigrants, but again, not significantly. When we look at non-college educated, they could be replacing the lost immigrants, but also not significantly. So then we thought, okay, so if individuals are not moving spatially to basically cover the loss of immigrants, maybe they are just moving from one sector to the other. So here what we do is we construct a dependent variable which captures mobility of natives across 17 broad sectors, which I already mentioned before. And then we also zoom in on the 5 broad sectors that had high immigrants and low remote work options. So these are food and accommodation services, non-durable manufacturing, transportation, construction, and other services. And we basically measure whether individuals, specifically natives, moved into or out of these sectors. And we analyze the sector mobility across states in response to immigration, controlling for the same variables we had before, so the remote work intensity and the demand shocks. So here are the figures. In the first outcome is mobility rate, so how many individuals just move across sectors. In mobility is how many individuals move into the 5 major sectors I already mentioned, and out mobility is how many individuals move out of these sectors. There is some evidence here that increased local labor demand that is measured through the Bartic index, that leads to increased mobility rate into and out of these 5 major sectors. The post-COVID drop in immigration might have induced some significant increase in cross-sector mobility of natives. And then finally, we do not actually find that there is a lot of change from the 5 major sectors that we focus on. So they don't move into these sectors or out of them. So just to summarize, the drop in immigrants was not offset by geographic mobility of natives in the short run. There is no evidence that they moved into the states that were losing these immigrants. And the mobility of employed natives across sectors also seems to have responded more to the drop in immigrants after COVID. And finally, the availability of remote work reduced native mobility across sectors. So the remote work could be a substitute for sector mobility in labor market adjustment. As a final exercise for today, what we did is we also checked whether the drop in immigration and lack of native cross-state response created labor imbalances, which we measure through the increase in vacancies. So here we run the same panel regression. The outcome, though, becomes the number of unfilled vacancies as a share of the 2010 state working age population. And we also run the OLS and 2SLS estimations. So although the results show the right sign of coefficients, there is no significance. So here there is very weak evidence of increase in vacancies across states associated with drop in immigrants and low remote work opportunities. Basically, if you want to quantify it, an immigrant drop of 2% of the population only explains vacancy growth by 0.1% of employment. So this is a very weak and small result. So just to conclude, the main findings of the paper is that first, there is a big drop in immigrants from late 2019 to mid 2021 that was especially concentrated among non-college young individuals and those working in manual intensive sectors. There is no significant change in interstate native mobility post-COVID or in response to the drop in immigrants. And the immigration drop and small response of natives could contribute to explain vacancies, especially in sectors with low remote work opportunities. However, this is very preliminary evidence. So definitely more data and years are needed to see what happens. And while the interstate native mobility response was a bit surprising, but it only confirms previous literature that shows that natives are not very responsive to labor market shocks, not as much as migrants at least. So when we do the same exercises for the 2010 and between the 2010 and 2019 period, we see the same response. We just thought post-COVID it might change, and we just see that it did not change. So that's all I have for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Reem, and that was super interesting and perfect timing.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, so let me introduce our discussion for today. It's going to be Kian. You have 10 minutes, and then we can open the discussion for everyone. Thanks a lot, Reem. Kian, go ahead with your
share the screen
slides. Yeah.
Can I see it clearly? A second.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, perfect.
First, it's my pleasure to discuss the paper today. I'm Tian. I'm a PhD candidate from Sanfei. Let me first just summarize the paper a little bit more. The paper is motivated by the fact that since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, international immigration flows to the US decreased dramatically. And this paper describes the evolution of the foreign-born immigration, remote work, and vacancies in the US, discuss the evolution of internal mobility of natives. The authors also estimated the responses of the native mobility in relationship to the pre- and post-COVID changes. They also analyze the correlation of these shocks with the unfilled job vacancies. The main finding is that the native mobility across states and sectors responds little to the post-COVID decline in immigration and the increases in remote work. This paper is very interesting, and it contributes to the literature on the COVID-19 pandemic, also adds to the literature on the low mobility of US-born labor force, and analyzes the effect of the decline in the international immigration. So while the paper is well written and the thoughts are very clear, the paper provides valuable insights into how cross-state native mobility is connected to foreign immigration, remote work options, and changes in labor demand before and after COVID-19. The paper's findings have important implications for policymakers who are interested in understanding how to address immigration and labor market dynamics during pandemics. After said this, I have several comments on the paper. So first, the panel estimates are at the state level. I'm not sure whether they try to use the individual level data to see which people may respond to the decline in the immigration and which people may do not respond to such shocks. Which maybe we can see some individual heterogeneity, even though there is no aggregate effects of the decline in immigration. The second point is that I know the authors, they control the sector-driven labor demand, but I'm not sure whether they have seen the interaction of the demand with the COVID-19. The reason is that the pattern may be different before and after the COVID. Another suggestion is that this paper documents that there is no response of internal migration to the significant drop in international immigration. But another interesting point is the why there is no response. The authors mentioned that the potential factors like the rigidity in the labor market or the moving costs, but it would be interesting to see some evidence of whether these factors really play a role in this effect. Another point is I'm not sure whether there is any policy restrictions, and the restrictions may be different across states, like the internal migration during COVID in the US is restricted. If so, perhaps this can be used to see some causal effect instead of only some correlation. Another point is that the native-born people may be, perhaps they are unwilling to move due to the development of the pandemic, such as the cases, the number of the people affected or dead due to COVID. I think they should use the COVID severity as a control variable. So regarding the literature, I think they can give more details about the very relevant papers. For example, the natives, the mobility has limited response to the inflow of the migrants in the pre-COVID area. They mentioned these two papers, but I think they can expand them and say why the response to the inflow of immigrants is very limited. And as well, the local employment shocks were mainly observed by the mobility of immigrants rather than the natives. I think they could give more details and say the whole story. I mean, especially the contribution part would be described in a sharper way, I think. Yeah. So thanks. That's all.
Thanks, Qian. So Reem, now maybe you can answer some of the comments if you want. It doesn't appear that we have questions in the chat or like people who want to ask questions in person for now. So yeah, we can just answer and we'll see later if there is more discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much for these comments. Actually, some of them we haven't thought about. Sometimes, to answer your question about the individual level data, it's very limited. So the CPS has an individual level panel part, which only includes people for almost 4 months and then leaves them out for 8 and then includes them for 4 again. But the heterogeneity by groups could be actually interesting. We can do that. The post-COVID interacted with Bartik also could be interesting, and that's true. And we haven't thought about it before, but you can also try that. Why no response of natives? That's still a puzzle up till now. Not only after COVID, even before COVID, why is their mobility declining and why do they not respond to shocks as much as immigrants is still largely unknown. And then whether there were any restrictions during COVID on internal migration, that's a very good and important point. I think we should think of that. Maybe we can divide states by those that were strict versus not. And we can check if there's any difference between those two.
Yeah, and also perhaps maybe the policies implemented different in different states gradually, and perhaps you can see something also.
Yeah, 100%. This is important. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, so I guess we can now open the discussion to all panelists and attendees as well. So if you have a question, you can just raise your virtual hand and I will give you the floor. So there is a question. Okay, Anna Maria, if you want.
Hi, Reem. So my question is about the specification that you estimate. So you have the variation in the immigrant share, which is variation over time, and then you interact that with the COVID dummy.
Right.
so you have both the immigrant share by itself and then the immigrant share times the COVID dummy. It seems to me like you're doing a mix between a diff and diff and a standard panel specification. And I wonder why. So are you assuming that the elasticity of internal mobility or all these outcome variables with respect to international migration changes, and why during COVID? Yeah, I thought that you would have simply exploited the variation in immigrant shares from before to after in a standard diff and diff.
So it's almost more than a different, like it's separate from a different diff. It's more like a standard shift share IV panel regression, where we look at the effect of migration or the change in immigration in a state over time on native mobility. But then the post dummy is just to capture whether there is a change after COVID. So it's just comparing the change before and after COVID. Does that make sense? Does it answer your question?
Yeah, but then, you know, are you focusing on this interaction? Because the interaction tells you how different this reaction is.
Yes.
But yeah,
So it's almost both. We focus on first the change in immigration on its own, and then we see whether the interaction is also different or it's significant to see whether there is this break after COVID. But both the change in immigration and the post times the change in immigration were not significant in most of the results.
Okay. And have you estimated specifications without the interaction?
We did not try. We can try that.
Yeah, because you know, just by putting the card, the immigrant share instrumented with the card instrument, you don't have this sudden change due to COVID, and so that variable by itself is going to capture the change in immigrant share that occurs during COVID.
Yes, I see your point. We can try that.
Yeah, because maybe you're asking too much from the data. That's why
yes, especially with the small number of periods. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, Lucas, go ahead.
Great, Reem, great presentation. Just two small comments. So the first one is that sometimes I feel that probably the COVID shock is more like stringent than the immigration shock. So I was wondering, I know the data is very limited in terms of observations, but in some source, if you can do some heterogeneity by COVID enforcement, or, you know, there are many papers about differences in politics with respect to the COVID, so Democrats and Republicans. I don't know. It's just something that I feel that COVID, especially in 2021, was something, I think it was the biggest wave, no, in terms of deaths and cases. So, I don't know, measuring native mobility in that year maybe a bit difficult. And the second thing is that I think the immigration or the lower immigration that you're seeing, which is huge, could be also translated into many other labor market outcomes. So I was thinking, like, if probably there is not much of natives moving between states, but there's some sector reallocation, you could also measure what happened to their wages or to their employment. So like the standard, you know, outcomes, because I think such a big shock or lower immigration shock. So I think there could be many things happening. But
100%. These are two very great points. So for the first point, it also elaborates on what Kinkin was saying. Like if we just separate the states by the strictness of measures taken because of COVID, especially in 2021, I agree, that's when the variants started appearing, the new variants. But that's why that also motivated looking at sector mobility. So we thought, let's say people actually stay in their state, which is more likely, then are they actually shifting to more remote, for instance, more remote jobs or sectors that have more availability for remote jobs? And we still do not see any effect. For wages, we are just starting to do that now. It is a labor market adjustment for sure. So we are going to look at wages. Yeah, that's it. I thought I had one more point to reply to you, and now I forgot. It skipped my mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Marielle.
Reem, this is related to what you were just discussing. So I'm wondering whether there's some heterogeneity in terms of state or government aid across sectors or specific occupations, because, well, as Lucas was saying, maybe during the pandemic, and as well, Kian mentioned, it's hard to see a lot of movers, but if you have more data afterwards, you can look at that. And I'm wondering whether part of that immobility, also in terms of sectoral location, might be because some workers were receiving some aids already where they were. So even for those that kind of lost their jobs, they have some kind of government support. And maybe there's some heterogeneity in that regionally, sectorally, and also in the way they introduced and removed this type of aids. I don't know if you have information about that or whether you could exploit that.
We don't have information about that. I think it is accessible though, so we can find information about that, and it's definitely a very good point. So for instance, I know in California, they were giving stimulus checks that are separate from the federal stimulus checks. So probably that is a great point. So I think we should control for one, the COVID-related mobility policies, and two, the policies related to stimulus checks or aid by state. I don't know if aid varied by sector, but I'm pretty sure it varied by state. So that's a very good point. Thank you.
Reem, there's also a question by Kamal Kassam in the chat who asks if there is a possibility to look at the adjustment among industries in terms of wages or flexibilities in working conditions.
We have, so wages, we are trying to do that now, but in labor conditions, no, not yet. Although this is important because now, given all of the basically labor shortages, workers have more bargaining power. So maybe they will change across sectors, so the labor conditions, but we do not look at that, no.
So just one quick thing, sorry I jump up, but there's this new paper by Dabi and co-authors that measures they call it the unexpected wage compression, and they in fact say that the bargaining power is increasing low educated workers and their wages, like the wage ratio respect to the highly educated workers is decreasing. So I think this immigration part could link very well to their argument that I don't think they have it.
That's interesting. I haven't seen the paper. I should check that paper.
Yeah, I can send it to you. And also because it's mostly what you're seeing. Also, there are the big drop in immigration is with non-college educated.
Yes, and things might be going up, back up. So it's all happening. So basically, we need more years to check what's happened. That's the main conclusion.
Anna Maria, if you.
Yeah, so the US was quite different from European countries in the sense that I don't think that there were a lot of restrictions in terms of mobility. And as a matter of fact, there is quite a lot of anecdotal evidence in terms of mobility to escape the effects of COVID and not to be stuck, for example, in cities. A lot of people left New York. So I wonder whether you can use data on mobility, not for employment reasons, to get a sense, because I think you use data specifically on internal mobility for employment reasons.
We include all of them, but we can divide the two. You can look at the two separately.
Yeah, you can divide it. Okay, because I think it would be interesting. And again, there is this evidence that people moved out also because of remote work. And compare these two different types of mobility.
Yes, that's a great idea.
Also because it allows you to net out the fact that maybe people didn't want to go to certain locations, although they were good from an economic point of view because of COVID, because maybe COVID incidence rates were very high in those locations.